And then nobody knows
yeah, it was like that. Where they actually moved.
I remember. They didn't move it too far. I bought all of this stuff that I've never. That's right. Chips. I just tell the kids that you got to just take it for adults. But they probably
Yes.
Thank you for coming. On behalf of the organizing committee of this forum, I welcome you to the Politics of Violence in Mexico, a public forum about the recent events in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero. This forum is part of the Global Forum Mexico, the Wound of the World, happening this week in more than 35 universities all across the world. This event is possible thanks to the generosity and patience of our professors, Patrick Dove, Peter Guardino, Bradley Levinson, and John McDowell, and the solidarity of the student community. The following video, done by the Global Forum Ayotzinapa Somos Todos, will help to put this event in context.
8 years ago, the President of Mexico, facing a highly contested election, decided to declare a war on drugs. To do this, he called the military to the streets. The results were that
Oh.
8 years ago, the President of Mexico, facing a highly contested election, decided to declare a war on drugs. To do this, he called the military to the streets. The results were that Mexico went from having 9,900 murders per year in 2005 to 23,000 in 2013. On December 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto, from the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, became President of Mexico. The PRI was in power from the 1920s until 2000 and had many accusations of disappearance and violence against students. Enrique Peña Nieto's first action as president was to create alliances with Congress to push for reforms, most of them related to the economy. He invested heavily in cleaning Mexico's image abroad, running various editorials in world newspapers, and pushed security to a less prominent place than his predecessor. Yet, the violence continued. Not because you ignore a problem, it Mexico goes away. In 2013 alone, 23,000 people were killed. 1 out of 3 homes reported to have been subject to a crime, and even the government accepts that more than 90% of crimes are never resolved. On September 26th, a group of students was protesting on Iguala, the 3rd largest city in Mexico's poorest state, Guerrero. The municipal government and the state government both belong to the opposition leftist party, PRD, Party of the Democratic Revolution. The local police came in, killed 3 students, and arrested the other 43. There is no record of the students in any jail. Other 3 people who were not in the protest were caught in the fire and died. Julio Cesar Mondragon, who had just become a father, was tortured to death. In the weeks that followed, 10 mass graves were discovered around Tijuana. The mayor of the town and his wife ran away after a local newspaper showed the mayor's brother-in-law was a drug dealer. He was finally found on the 4th of November, hiding in Mexico City. While this crisis was going on, the president of Mexico decided to go on tour to China and Australia, as they are important business partners. But it has been more than a month, and he has yet to visit Iguala, less than 5 hours drive from Mexico City. On November 7th, Mexico's Attorney General gave a press conference where he announced that according to some of those interrogated who showed signs of torture, they believed the students had been killed and burned. The parents refused to accept this information until reliable DNA sources are presented. When he thought the microphone was off, he told his aide to end the questions as he was tired. Ya me cansé. We stand here today saying, we are also tired. Tired of a government that cares more about macroeconomic deals than the security of its people. Tired of corruption. Tired of fighting a war of drugs that will only be solved when demand in the United States decreases. Tired of unsolvable crimes. The state has a responsibility to protect its population. We ask you to do 3 things. Write to your local Mexican embassy or consulate to demand justice. Attend local events in your area to create awareness. Spread the word. Mexican politicians cannot hide if the world is watching them.
A mi hermanito enseñé, jugando en aquel patio en la escuela. A mi hermanito enseñé. Como no había carruaje, me puse a trabajar. Hice mi examen de entrada con ansias, contento de ir a estudiar. Hice mi examen de entrada con ansias a esa escuela rural. El 26 de septiembre sucedió todo lo peor. Fuimos todos agredidos con armas por el gobierno opresor, tirando a darnos directo a manzana. Mi hermanito cayó.
And now, let me introduce you to our moderator, Professor Patrick Dove, Director of Graduate Studies of the Spanish and Portuguese Department, whose work engages modern contemporary Latin American literature, philosophy, and political thought.
Thanks, Gal. Can everybody hear okay? So first of all, just a quick word of acknowledgement to both Val and Tammy for all of the hard work in a very, very condensed amount of time. It's really quite admirable what you two have managed to put together. And thanks to everybody here for this really strong turnout. This is encouraging to see this number of people who are concerned and wanting to know more and wanting to show support. So just a few words about my understanding of what is possibly at stake here, and then we'll turn to our three panelists, each of whom will present some aspect of the context of the forum and what the forum is talking about. And then I think at the end we'll have time for comments and questions from the audience. So I was reading yesterday in Al Jazeera a column that was talking about a public demonstration in New York in solidarity with this forum idea. And some passerby came up and was curious about what was going on, what were these people protesting, and when they learned that it was about the disappearance of 43 normal students in Mexico, the question was, well, this is the US, why should we care? So it struck me that one question to begin with might be, this is IU, why should we care? And if we think about IU's own institutional self-understanding as a university with an international scope, for both in terms of the demographics here, of students and faculty, in terms of the numbers of programs that deal with area studies and language flagship programs, the New School of Global and International Studies. This is an event that has international importance. And some of us may feel that Latin America hasn't necessarily gotten the same amount of attention at the university in recent years. It seems to me that this is potentially kind of a wake-up call. If we look at the amount of the funding that the US government and the US taxpayers put into initiatives like Moderator, something like $3 billion over the last 6 years, in a program that was described by Thomas Sheehan, who was the Assistant Secretary for State for Western Hemispheric Affairs under George W. Bush, as the Moderator, that is, as the armoring of NAFTA. So it's clear that we have an event that speaks to us of the interrelatedness between the state, between the US and Mexico, and the US and Mexican states, and between the state and global capital, and also between the state, global capital, and narco-trafficking. That these issues are inseparable, and they have to be thought together. And this is an event that really speaks to that interconnection between those different elements. So before I turn it over to Bradley Levinson, let me just read a quick snippet from a column written by the Guatemalan US writer Francisco Goldman for The New Yorker on October 30th, 2014. The column is entitled, "Crisis in Mexico, Could 43 Missing Students Spark a Revolution?" Goldman writes, "Many in Mexico have wondered why the missing 43 have inspired such outrage in a country that has long since grown anesthetized to mass violence. In the past, government authorities have relied on a worn playbook: stigmatize the victims, depict them as responsible for their own fates, or point out ways in which they were not ordinary Mexicans. Some have been trying to do the same with the missing 43, but the accusations don't resonate. Most of the students were still in their teens in their first semester at school and came from impoverished communities that a majority of Mexicans can identify with. They can't credibly be criminalized as guerrillas or narcos. The voids in Mexico's government are all too obvious now. The country seems to be trembling at the edge of a terrible cataclysm, or, for the hopeful, an inspiring transformation. It's also possible that the path to solving Mexico's problems need not be so drastic. Flawed and abused as it has been, the country is still a democracy. It continues to have elections. In 2000, Mexican voters finally put an end to the 71 years of authoritarian and corrupt pre-rule, only to turn the government over to a rightist party, the PAN, which ended up at the behest of the US plunging the country into the narco war, the results of which we are all living with now. Mexicans now have another chance to potentially reinvent their country. Now is the time for new leaders and even new parties to emerge from the civic movements and from outside the discredited political establishment. What many Mexicans have been telling me is this: it's either now or never. So our first speaker is Professor Bradley Levinson, who is Professor of Education at Indiana University. His research looks at such topics as student culture and identity formation at the secondary level in Mexico and the United States, civic and citizenship education for democracy, and transnational migration. He's the author of We Are All Equal, Student Culture and Identity at a Mexican Secondary School, 1988 to 1998, with Duke University Press, and has co-edited a series of books on education with titles such as Reimagining Civic Education, How Diverse Societies Form Democratic Citizens. His presentation is entitled Democratization, Civil Society, and the Struggle for Education Reform.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon to all of you. Good afternoon to anybody who may be viewing this now or later via live stream or podcast. I want to energetically second Patrick's gratitude to Gael and to Tamara and to the rest of the student committee that did most of the organizing for this. And I want to give a big thank you to all of you for taking time on this Friday before Thanksgiving break on a cold afternoon to come out here. I'd like to give ourselves all a big round of applause. I think that, as you can already tell, this is really part of the goal of the organizers of this global forum, to show that there is great interest not only in Mexico and not only amongst certain sectors of Mexican society, but that the recent crimes in Mexico resonate globally, and that since Mexico is so concerned about its international image, about international investment and so forth, that whatever we can do, those of us who are not Mexican citizens, to express our outrage is going to assist those activists and those citizens in Mexico to press forward with their claims as well. So what we are witnessing, a little bit of what I'm going to say is perhaps going to echo what was said in what was shown in the video. I didn't have a chance to see it ahead of time or to know what Patrick was going to say, so my apologies if there's any redundancy, but I think some of these bear repeating. What we're witnessing in Mexico today: mass street protests, the taking or sacking of government buildings, the blocking of highways, energetic protests to legislators and politicians, is the culmination really of years, if not decades, of frustration and anger. About what is this frustration and anger? Well, it's about, first and foremost, perhaps, about extreme levels of inequality in Mexico, how the wealth that gets generated is not shared. It's also about an arrogant and insular political class who cynically manipulates popular opinion in order to impose the will of millions. These same politicians may wield a populist discourse, but in practice, as we can see, defend their own narrow interests at all costs and using all means, including naked political repression, extortion, and murder. And then finally, it's about high-level collusion between politicians, state security personnel, and the armed force of the drug cartels, as we can see in the most recent case. So that's the kind of negative energy, if you will, behind these protests. But on the sort of on the claim side, on the positive side, it's also about demanding the minimum protections under democratic rule of law. It's about demanding more transparency, accountability, and security. And it's about basic respect, fairness, and justice. In sum, it's about democratization and the realization of democratic promises that are contained in the very Mexican Constitution that was passed during the revolution in 1917 and whose promises have yet to be realized. Es el colmo, as Mexicans would say. We've reached our limit, we're fed up. Or, as we saw in the video, ya me cansé, I'm tired of this already. A sardonic reference to the Attorney General Jesus Murillo Caram's comment after a long press conference on the investigation into the disappearance of the 43 students. This phrase, ya me cansé, as you can see, now gets repeated over and over again because it was seen as such an insult for such a high-level politician to sort of, casually say, I'm kind of tired of this already. I need to give a break. And people in Mexico say, well, welcome to our world. We're tired of the kind of stuff that we've been subject to. And you, as an agent of public justice, ought to work tirelessly in order to combat this problem. So I wanted to just hit a couple of points briefly. One is to situate this, this latest round of protests and the fact that these were students that are missing and likely murdered, I'm afraid, in the context of the history of student protest in Mexico. Here we are at Indiana University, and historically, certainly from the 20th century onward, university students have served as a kind of social conscience and as social activists, and this is certainly the case in Mexico. So where were the students from the Ayotzinapa normal school, Isidro Burgos normal school? Where were they headed when they were ambushed, and what were they aiming to do? Well, it's important to note that the best evidence we have suggests that the students were, in fact, excuse me, lost my place here, were trying to commandeer transportation to join the October 2nd commemorations in Mexico City. Now, I have to say right here, and perhaps a little bit in counterpoint to the view expressed by Francisco Goldman, perhaps what complicates the matter of these students is that they're not as innocent as many sectors of American society, and Mexican society, I should say, do not see these students as being completely blameless, completely innocent. The tactics that they have used in recent years have included stealing or commandeering public transportation and buses, sometimes using throwing stones and other quasi-violent techniques in protests. And so that kind of complicates the matter, although of course it's no excuse at all for the level of repression that's been used. But they were apparently in the act of commandeering transportation, probably because they're so poor that they can't even afford, really, they don't own their own vehicles and they can't even afford the cost of a bus ticket to Mexico City to join the October 2nd commemorations. October 2nd, as many of you know, is the commemoration of the 1968 massacre in the Plaza Tlatelolco, which was a watershed moment of political consciousness in Mexico, when hundreds and perhaps thousands of mainly Mexican university and even high school students were gunned down in cold blood because they were protesting the lack of democracy and the level of repression in Mexico. And this was in the run-up to the 1960 hosting of the Olympics in Mexico. So it is really more than ironic, it's tragic that on September 26th, just about a week before those celebrations, another massacre occurred. But the mayor of Iguala apparently assumed that the students were instead bent on disrupting a political speech by his wife, and that this would have been yet another in a series of ongoing disturbances created by the students who had been protesting a number of issues ranging from the poor funding of their school to the collusion between state and local politicians and wealthy drug lords. One of the nicknames, as you saw in the video, of the school at Ayotzinapa is the Cuna de la Conciencia, or the cradle of social awareness or consciousness, referring to an awareness of inequalities and injustice. And apparently the mayor of Iguala had finally reached the limits of such consciousness raising. And in a brazen and shocking manner, the mayor appears to have ordered the municipal police to ambush the students. 6 people died in the shootout. 43 surviving students were taken away and handed over by local police to local drug mafia known as the Guerreros. So I would just finish my little contextualization here by pointing a little bit to the history of the normal schools in Mexico, from which these students emerged, and so-called normalistas, as they're called, students that attend normal schools, escuelas normales rurales. They were created, they were specifically rural institutions that were created in the 1920s. They became, in sort of the development of post-revolutionary public education in Mexico, they served from the 1930s forward as strong proponents of so-called socialist education, which was part of Lázaro Cárdenas's education agenda in Mexico during her presidency. And they have served always as an important route of social mobility for children of poor campesino families. Most of the students who attend these rural normal schools, teacher training schools, are there in an internado, a kind of boarding school. And ever since the more conservative turn in Mexican politics in the 1940s and 1950s, these schools have been under-resourced and struggling really to kind of maintain their existence. For many years, the normal school was essentially a specialized high school, and graduates could begin teaching primary school at the age of 18. But especially since teacher education in Mexico became declared a kind of bachelor's level degree, licenciatura level degree, in the mid-1980s, and thus became offered as a career track by a proliferation of other universities and other kinds of normal schools. The normales rurales, the rural normal schools like Ayotzinapa, have struggled to survive. They're still a critical source of trading for poor rural students who can't afford to move to the cities and bear the opportunity costs involved. And because they tend to have kind of radical popular ideology, the state has tried to supplicate them. But they've usually enjoyed strong support from the National Teachers Union, the Sindicato Nacional de Trabajadores de la Educación, to whom they are loyal, and so that has kind of kept them really in existence. The struggle for improving the quality and resources for the normales rurales is part of the broader struggle over the teaching profession and the quality of the education system in Mexico. The question of who has the right to teaching positions and how educational quality gets assured, and that was among some of the many things that these students were protesting in the lead up to the massacre. So I would just end very briefly by saying really my point is to really see this moment and this particular protest as a part of the struggle for fuller democratization in Mexico, which has antecedents that go back well over a century, but which many people feel really got going in 1980s, many points in the 1985 earthquake as a watershed moment. Carlos Monsiváis, in his book La Crónica de la Sociedad que se Organiza, the society that organizes itself, brought attention to the way that up until that time, the huge single-party state, which grew fat on oil reserves and oil sales in Mexico, was able to quell most popular unrest by providing a minimum of social benefits for the population. But people always looked to the state for solutions to their problems, and they hadn't really organized the texture of civil society. It was really that moment when the state was unable to meet their demands and the needs of people after this horrendous earthquake that people began to organize themselves, create civil associations, and from there we have a kind of flourishing of the NGO civil society sector, which is demanding to be an important interlocutor and an important player in politics, but still gets largely shut out from Mexican politics. And I have a little more to say, but I think I'm over time, so I'll give it over to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker is John McDowell, who is professor of folklore and ethnomusicology. He studies vernacular artistic performances in the Americas. His most recent monograph is entitled Poetry and Violence, the Ballad Tradition of Mexico's Costa Chica, with the University of Illinois Press. And today he'll be introducing us to certain musical responses to the events of Ayotzinapa.
Thank you, Patrick. And good afternoon, everybody. Thanks. En primer lugar, un saludo cordial a todos que me están oyendo y felicidades al equipo organizador. This is a very important event, and I'm very pleased to be here. When I thought about sitting up here, I asked myself two questions, and I want to repeat those questions to all of you and just give you a sketch of how I answered these questions, or maybe how I might think about answering these questions. The first question is, why are we here? And this was already broached by Patrick. And in particular, why am I here? So I think, well, we are professors, we are students, we are human beings, and I think we are connected to things that happen in other places. I have my own particular reasons for being here, which is that I have worked with corridos, the ballads, down in Mexico, including particularly in the state of Guerrero, and I have spent a lot of time in Chilpancingo, in Ometepec, in Acapulco. I've been through Iguala, but I can't say that I've spent much time there. And so this is a place that is very important to me. I have many friends that I am still in contact with in Guerrero, and because of this personal connection, I do feel the disappearance of the 43 very personally. The second question that I posed to myself, and I'll now pose to all of you, or respond to in front of all of you, is what can I contribute to this discussion as a folklorist? Well, the folklorist hears the voice of the people, especially those utterances that are built on tradition and find creative ways of finding meaning in the experiences that confront us in life. The voice of the people at times falls into a kind of a commemorative mode. And this is a situation when people and events are summoned up and elevated as we examine them and try to find meaning out of chaos. This sense-making occurs through a movement on two planes. On the plane of expression, there's a movement towards artful execution. On the plane of semantics, there's a movement towards central truth. And one of the great forms of commemorative discourse is song. Song is a form that brings music and words together. The semantics, the meaning, the expressions are in the words. The music adds a level of emotional connection that maybe words alone cannot achieve. So song is a great example, and I want to turn to that in a moment. I'm especially drawn to what I think of as zones of commemoration, especially folk commemoration, the kinds of commemoration that really springs out of the grassroots level, comes from the people themselves. A great example of that is the corrido of Mexico, which I have studied. Worked with that ballad form on the Costa Chica, which is a region in the state of Guerrero, which spreads on over into the neighboring state of Oaxaca. And when I was down in Guerrero in the 1970s, initially tracking down corridos, I started to hear ballads about Genaro Vázquez and Lucio Cabañas. And so who were these guys? Well, it turns out both of them had been students at Ayotzinapa. So they were graduates of that Escuela Normal. And they had worked tirelessly and effortlessly to try to bring about some social change in the state of Guerrero, which was then and continues to be the most poverty-struck state in the nation. And they just encountered closed doors. They were not able to achieve anything at all through the normal channels. And so both of them rose up in opposition to the government. And it was the 1970s, the early 70s, was a very hot time in Guerrero. But as we see from the recent events from September 26th, things haven't really changed all that much. So what I'd like to do now is just share with you all some examples of musical productions that are springing up on YouTube. There are literally hundreds of these things. Many corridos are being performed and recorded and uploaded onto YouTube, but not only corridos, there's rap music, rock and roll, there's a nueva canción, a kind of more traditional type of protest song. There are a number of different song genres that are being utilized by people who are conscientiously trying to respond to these events, find some meaning, channel their anger, their anguish, their frustration into a form, a poetic and musical form that might help, in a sense, capture the meaning of these events. So this involves, I suppose, all of us relocating, because I think the screen has to come back down. Okay, so let's do this. So everybody can hear me, right? So due to restrictions on time, we're just going to look at a brief sample of these, and you all can go online yourselves and find many more. The first one I want to play is a corrido. It's a father and son pair. They're from Guerrero, and the style of their music reminds me very much of the sort of grassroots corridos that I was hearing back in the 1970s when I first began attending to the corrido tradition down in Guerrero.
Mis cuerdas están llorando y mi corazón te quiere. lágrimas ajenas murieron 43. Llegaron a Ayotzinapa para inactivarte como puedes ahora ser maestro y recordar la nación. The chords of the guitar are crying and the heart is wounded. It's a personal sort of entree into the story, and then the father and son, with the son singing, he goes on to narrate some sort of scenes from the story of the disappeared 43. Okay, let's go to the next sample that I have. And this takes us into a different genre, and also takes us to another location. That's fine.
Sí hay miedo, pero sí hay un todo apagando. El mismo gobierno ha hecho que nosotros salgamos a las calles a exigir justicia sin temor a que pase algo. Y si ya nos han quitado todo, ¿qué más nos pueden quitar?
¿Cómo le explicas a una madre que su hijo desapareció, que alguien se lo llevó, ya jamás volvió? La raza de Ayotzinapa es un crimen de Estado, es un crimen repudiado por los mexicanos. Desaparición cruzada de estudiantes normalistas como si ellos fueran los terroristas. Atacaron directamente sin razón ni bala, eran gritos contra ráfagas de balas. Cabrón, piensa no pudo haber sido vivo, da igual si estudiase Guerrero o en un distrito, porque poco a poco van a ir por nosotros. Pero todos los asesinos tienen rostro, criminalizan la lucha social. Si no les gusta lo que haces, te mandan a asesinar. Qué fácil es culpar al crimen organizado para deslindarse de todo el daño que han causado. Esto no es una obra del crimen organizado, no, esto es un crimen de Estado.
So that production comes to us from H. Novoa, who comes out of Venezuela, and he says that he's hooked on rap, and that he assembled this from just the images he was able to secure from the internet. Let me go on to my next example. Good.
No sé cómo empezar a cantar esto que debo, mas si he de partir de cero, tendría que preguntar cómo se puede un tal nivel de injusticia. Triste comenzó septiembre por la tragedia nefasta, la bandera media asta que no dure hasta noviembre. Hoy resuenan en mi mente las voces de Ayotzinapa.
This comes to us from a woman singer out of Quito, Ecuador. So it's in more of the sort of nueva canción or the protest style that we might trace back to Chile in an earlier period. Let me give you maybe, we might have time for one more example.
Es inconcebible simplemente no se entiende para ti también, porque tú te lo mereces, has estado luchando tu vida todos los días. ¿Están listos?
So this, some of you know the band Los Caifanes from Mexico City, a concert and an introduction to a song which is commemorating and bringing to people's attention the disappeared 43. So I hope you all are moved by the power of song. The many voices of the people raised in protest, anger, and anguish speak to the incredible Mexican love of song and to the gravity of the Ayotzinapa situation and the very disturbing questions that it raises about Mexico. But I have to say that these voices give me hope that a better tomorrow awaits us if we can only find our way there. Ayotzinapa somos todos. Gracias. Thank you, Nana.
Thank you, John. Our third speaker is Peter Guardino, who is a professor of history. His research and teaching focuses on colonial and post-independence Mexico, and he's author of 2 books, The Time of Liberty, Popular Political Culture in Oaxaca, Duke University Press, and Peasants, Politics, and the Formation of Mexico's National State, Guerrero, 1800 to 1857, Stanford University Press. Peter just returned from Mexico yesterday and will speak to us about connections between the events of Ayotzinapa and economic transactions between the U.S. and Mexico.
I'd also like to begin by thanking the organizers who've done an incredible job in a very short amount of time. I'd also like to thank you all for coming. When this came up, this possibility came up, I voiced skepticism about, via the emails, about whether anyone would actually come at noon before Thanksgiving. And then I went to Mexico and started to get emails on, we have to put it in a bigger place because more people are coming than we expected. And I still was skeptical, and you're here. I want to thank you for being here. So, and the answer to the question of why we're here, I mean, for me, is that I'm angry. Okay. 43 young men whose faces you see on the walls here, who are probably only 2, 3, 4 years older than my own son, and about the age of my daughter, have disappeared. Apparently, they were basically kidnapped by the local police of Iguala on the orders of a local politician, turned over to a drug gang, and killed. Okay. And I have to say, as much as I would like to see the 43 appear alive, as people are demanding, I think it very unlikely. Okay. Violence, crime, corruption, a government that seems weak or is possibly in some ways complicit. This kind of story plays in the U.S. as a very Mexican story. Okay? These are things, violence, crime, corruption, are things that in American popular culture people associate with Mexico. If you want to really go back, you can see, how from the first Hollywood movies where Mexico appeared, these are the things that are associated with Mexico in American culture. Okay. There's a way in which, if you look at the way the American media handles this, it sort of externalizes the story. The story is a Mexican story. What I want to point out to you today, though, is that as much as this is a very Mexican story,
a very significant part of the engine of all of this violence is in the United States, in the behavior of American consumers and in the behavior of American politicians. Okay? It's the American market for illicit drugs that sends billions and billions of dollars crashing over the Mexican border into Mexico every year. Patrick mentioned that we have a plan very done, which we spent $3 billion trying to shore up NAFTA. He also mentioned to me earlier, I hadn't actually looked up estimates for this amount of money, but he mentioned to me earlier when we were standing around waiting for the event to begin, he'd heard an estimate of $30 billion every year being repatriated to Mexico from the drug trade. I told him I thought that was a little bit low. But imagine, even if it was only $30 billion, $3 billion the government spends trying to shore up Mexican security, $30 billion is spent, goes into Mexico, flowing from the drug trade. It's not only dollars that flow into Mexico, it's also weapons. Not all of them, okay, but many of the weapons that are actually used by criminals in Mexico are actually purchased legally in the United States by people who then wholesale them to drug gangs across the border. So to some extent, we have to think about our policy about weapons. Okay. What you have to think about when you think about this is this huge, tidal wave of money. I really think about it as being a kind of wave. Provides people who want to participate in this commerce an essentially unlimited amount of money to use to destabilize the Mexican state and to corrupt individual Mexican policemen and politicians. From their point of view, the amount of money that they have to do this is that they can make you any offer that they need to make you. We also need to understand that those offers that they make to Mexican policemen and to Mexican politicians are usually two-sided offers. The notion being, you can work with us and get the kind of money that you could never make in public service. Or if you don't really want to accept that offer, we will threaten you, we will threaten your family, and they do carry out these threats. So people who actually resist this corruption are often killed or have family members killed. You noticed in the video, they showed different images toward the beginning of the video of the drug war, and you noticed that some of the soldiers involved, or policemen involved, were masked. The reason that they're masked is to try to protect them from this kind of protection. It's not to try to protect them from you knowing who they are. It's to try to protect them from criminals knowing who they are, so they don't have to face this kind of pressure. Okay, it's not necessarily a very effective tactic, but it's practically the only thing they can do about that. So when you think about the insecurity that Mexicans face on a daily basis, okay, and they think about it all the time, and you think about massacres, like the one that we're here to talk about today, I want you to imagine this money, especially the money, more the money than the guns, flowing from the U.S. to Mexico. There's another way in which American government policy has contributed to this dramatic insecurity. This is a way that was actually mentioned in the video. We placed, beginning about 15 years ago, and actually got it put into practice about 10 years ago, tremendous amounts of pressure we placed on the Mexican government to follow a particular policy in the drug war. A policy intended to go after the big guys, go after the couples, the heads of drug organizations. Okay? It was done, okay, at great cost and very effectively. The number of these high-ranking drug lords who have been incarcerated or killed in shootouts in the last 10 years is really very, very impressive. It was very much a tactical victory. It was a strategic disaster. It was a strategic disaster for various reasons. One reason was that if you take these established gangs that have established territories and arrangements among themselves about who's going to control what route. And you eliminate the people who made those treaties. You set off a war between gangs. And a lot of that increase in violence that you saw in the graph in the video is essentially the result of that war between gangs that was set off by a Mexican government policy that we pressured the Mexican government to do. So that's one reason why the violence went up so much. No. We also, when we decapitate these gangs, what we did is we created competition among the next level of people over who was going to be the next capo, who was going to be the next head of this or that cartel. And again, this caused dramatic amounts of violence. That's another reason why the violence continued. A more insidious way in which this policy contributed to the violence is that the people who were at the tops of those gangs tended to be very immoral and very greedy, and very willing to use violence to earn money. But as you kept cutting off the tops of the head, whoever risen to the top, eventually you get down to the level of people who are very violent, who are very immoral and very greedy, but for whom violence is less a means to an end than it is a way of life, where violence is the first thing they use to try to solve a problem, rather than violence is just one of their necessary tools. Okay. In a very strange way, the gunmen have risen to the top of a lot of these gangs, even as the gangs have fragmented. The sort of business guys are out, okay? And we took them out. Okay. And it's a we. All right, it's not just the Mexican government who did this. So if you combine these things, if you think about that policy, and especially I want you to again imagine this tidal wave of money coming across the border, it's hard to imagine how any government in the world could take this situation and still provide security for the people, for its citizens. I think if this amount of money proportionally were flowing here from Canada in exchange for illegal Hoosier corn, we would all be living in fear here. Yeah. Right? We would. Okay. Yeah. So then I want you to turn to think about why this amount of money continues to flow across the border. And the answer there has less to do with the dysfunction of the Mexican government and more to do with the dysfunction of our own political system. Yeah. We're in a situation here where we have followed essentially the same policy about drugs since at least the Nixon administration. Okay, sure, with variations. Every policy has a slight variation on this. Okay? But generally speaking, we follow the same policy. Okay? We're in a situation where American politicians, as usual, are more focused on their own re-election than they are on making any kind of effective government policy. And they believe, that Americans believe, that the drug problem is simple. There are bad criminals, and there are weak people who become addicts. And therefore, the solution is to throw a lot of people in jail. And it also helps that they can typically take this drug problem, they can push, and this happens often in popular culture too, they can push it onto others. It's a problem of African American gangs in cities. It's a problem of Latino gangs in cities. It's a problem of Colombian drug lords or Mexican drug lords. And it's not something that has to do with your sort of average drug consumer who is probably pretty white and pretty middle class. And in doing this, okay, we pour money into what they call interdiction, trying to prevent drugs from flowing into the United States. We pour money into jails to jail low-level drug lords and drug marketers and addicts. And we do an awful lot of that, and very little of any kind of effort to prevent drug addiction or to treat drug addiction. Very, very little financially in terms of the money that we put into it. Okay. And we show lots of stories about Mexican drug lords in the media. And we all feel very safe here, and we've just kind of exported the insecurity. So clearly, as you can see me here, I just got back from Mexico late last night. I didn't have much time to prepare, and I'm very angry. I'm kind of troubling a little bit up here. But what I want you to think about, and I certainly agree with the organizers of the Worldwide event, that it's important that we put pressure on the Mexican government to try to do what it can to provide security for its citizens. Okay? But I think it's also important that we think about what can be done here. How much of the origins of the problems really are here on this side of the border? And if we fail to own up to that, okay, I don't think that even the most honest and effective Mexican politician is going to be able to do much to provide security for Mexican citizens. And thank you again for coming.
So we have about 20 minutes, and I'm assuming that our panelists are willing to respond to comments and questions. Are there any from the audience?
Well, it seems to me the drug war has been so wrong-headed, as you all have pointed out. It's merely fueled the violence both in this country and in Mexico. And while I don't think I would approve of full legalization, if our governments were decided all of a sudden to decriminalize drugs and somehow regulate them, that would go along. Then the gangs would no longer have a raison d'être.
That's good. Okay. There are certainly many opinions about this. When I think about this problem, I think I would not favor decriminalizing cocaine and heroin, okay? Although some people do. Okay? But when I think about it more in terms of what we actually pour money into, okay? If we pour less money into jails,
that's right,
and more money into actually trying to prevent addiction, okay? And more money into trying to treat addiction, there's a chance that we could start to diminish the market for these drugs. And I think decriminalization of use of drugs might be very much a part of that, because you can treat addicts better if they're willing, if they can tell you they're addicts without being thrown into jail.
Yes.
Okay? But I would not necessarily be in favor of a large-scale decriminalization on the scale of the Colorado decriminalization of marijuana for cocaine and heroin anyway.
Yeah, I would say that with Colorado and Washington State, we may be witnessing the beginning of a shift in national consciousness on this issue. It would be interesting to see how things go in the coming years.
I have two questions. First off, thank you. The first question is, I have a lot of family who lives on the border of Mexico and Texas, and from part of my life, I lived in the frontera, and the drug problem was more becoming like a lifestyle for many of the youth. I know you spoke briefly just now about how we can change some of the things, what we can do here in terms of how we can stop this issue in the United States. What else do you think we can do in terms of, as students and as people that aren't really connected to the drug problem, well, those who aren't? And also, second question is, my cousin from Mexico sent me a link that talks that there's academic professors discussing the 43 as becoming a symbol. Through corridos and through other means, they're becoming a symbol. So how do you feel like this symbol is going to be a marker for change in activism, and what is going to happen as a result of this new symbol?
Well, as far as I would just really echo a bunch of what Peter has said already in terms of what we can do. We can do things both domestically and in terms of expressing our solidarity and our outrage, solidarity with folks in Mexico who have been suffering from this kind of action. I guess I would, Peter's points are all very well taken. Even politicians and certainly local police are between a rock and a hard place when they're told you to cooperate with us or we'll kill you. But what really, there are a couple of recurring terms in kind of Mexican popular discourse. One of them is impunity. la impunidad, right? And the other one is la prepotencia, which is kind of hard to translate into English. I guess it would be the sense of unlimited power and unchecked power. And these terms really express the essence of the anger of the Mexican people. How is it possible that the mayor of Iguala, how would it even occur to him to think that he could get away with telling his police, sácalos a estos, no, just get rid of these guys, right? And that he could get away with that. And that's the essence of prepotencia, right? The feeling that you are above the law and that you have this unlimited, unchecked power, and that you can do so with impunity, that down the line no one's going to ever really bring you to justice. So I think that Peter's sort of looking at a longer-term vision and the broader vision, which is crucial to sort of really alter the conditions that enrich and embolden drug cartels to be able to put this kind of pressure on politicians, but then the justice system on the other side does not hold people accountable, and I think that's the height of anger. So we, as citizens here, we can pressure our representatives and elect them according to their stances on the issue of whether they're favoring more construction of prisons or more liberal laws about gun use, or we can favor other policies, as well as communicating our displeasure to the government of Mexico in various ways. And as for the symbol, probably John can speak to that better, but I think that, like we said, Mexicans kind of, there have been a series of events. One of them was the murder of a number of people outside of Cuernavaca several years ago, which one of them was the son of the poet Javier Sicilia, which led to the Caravan of Peace that went up to Ciudad Juarez. There have been a number of killings and events that have kind of led up to this moment, but none of them have perhaps reached a kind of iconic status, if you will, such as the massacre of Tlatelolco in 1968. And so, if there's any silver lining whatsoever to be had in this tragedy, is that perhaps the magnitude of this, the way in which it occurred, the numbers that are involved, the youth of the students will enable it, in fact, to serve as a rallying symbol.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning the corrido in your question. Let's hope that this is El Colmo, that we've reached the point where this is the incident that will become symbolic of a point of no return, that this, ya basta, this is enough. It's hard to know because there have been so many episodes, as Bradley mentioned, a couple of them, and then the fire and the deaths in the casino in Monterrey, which, because that was mostly women, and it seemed not to fall into the general pattern of, at least the way this likes to be portrayed, as the victims had it coming, and yet that episode has subsided. I'm sure it's still pretty current in Monterrey, but largely outside, not so much. I hope a forum like this can contribute, and the many responses that are happening around the country, around the world, can contribute to making the disappearance of the 43 that moment when people say, that's enough, we're not going to take this anymore. Estamos cansados, right? Not of talking about it. We're tired of living this.
I have a point. So, Peter raised some interesting issues, and then there's a question that Bradley addressed about what we can do here. The violence is going on because of the transactions between the United States and Mexico also involve all of Central America. The two countries with the highest murder rate per capita are El Salvador and Honduras. And why? Because the U.S. deported the members of drug gangs from California, LA, to those countries. And the question is, for example, why are people in LA and other these communities involved in the drug trade in ours? Because the lack of opportunity for meaningful jobs, employment, involvement with the society. In the state of Indiana, this is with regard to the prison population, the state of Indiana calculates the number of jail cells, prison cells that are going to be built by looking at the number of students in 2nd and 3rd grade. And on the basis of that number of students, they figure immediately a certain percentage of them are going to get in jail, be in jail. Not in terms of taking the money to invest in education, but immediately to invest in the prison industry. So there's a lot that goes on here in terms of what we're doing with education, providing a meaningful life for our minority populations, and looking at how we're affecting the rest of the world, including deporting these people back to Central America and Mexico. Any comments?
Bravo.
Amen.
When I mentioned the notion of investing in preventing addiction, that's exactly the kind of thing that I was talking about. People get into things to get away from reality. If reality is less pleasant for you, you're more likely to get into them. So, I mean, this is the kind of thing that Professor Arnott was talking about.
Toward the back of the yes.
Along the lines that have just been raised, it seems to me that there are two other aspects of this, among many others, that I'd like you to address here, the last speaker. One has to do with how the United States is complicit in other ways. For example, we train the military and the police, not only in Central America, but in Mexico as well. Can that be leveraged? The second aspect of all of this has to do that the Mexican government is very much in the process of privatizing. PEMCO is now going private, and there is a concerted effort on the part of the government to encourage foreign investment. Well, can we leverage that? Can we use the new trade agreement? Can we condition foreign American private investment in Mexico's economy on the basis of the government holding accountable, being held accountable?
Okay. That's a very difficult question. I think the thing that makes it most difficult is the fact that Mexico is not Honduras, or Mexico is not El Salvador. Well, Mexico really relies on its trade with the United States a lot. Money that the U.S. government, directly spends on things like training police or providing even weapons or helicopters to the police in Mexico has historically been a very small part of the money that they spend on the drug wars. They're willing. I mean, they certainly are not immune to pressure from the U.S. I mean, this war against the capos was really a result of pressure from the U.S. That shows that the Mexican government is not immune to being told what to do, getting leverage from the U.S. But I suspect the leverage that the U.S. has in Mexico is probably less now than it ever has been before, because many Mexican politicians, including Peña Nieto, understand that the war against the capos was a really bad idea. Okay? And that this pressure led to something really terrible, and I suspect that he's going to be skeptical. Okay. I still think it's unlikely that the American political system is going to come up with policies that it wants to follow that will actually address this problem in Mexico. And I really, believe it or not, I'm more cynical about American politicians than Mexican politicians. Perhaps more so after this November.
You mentioned earlier that this tragedy has been seen as a wake-up call to the United States public in regards to the Mexican war on drugs. And my question is, what effect, if any, do you feel that this event could possibly have on the United States government's immigration policy, specifically in regards to Mexican immigration to the United States?
Well, it's a good question. I don't think any of us has a crystal ball. Of course, we have the dynamics that have been set in motion just as of yesterday with Obama's speech and the executive measures that he wants to take. And it's been well known that migration to the U.S. is a so-called safety valve for the Mexican economy, for the inability for the Mexican economy to grow, but more importantly, for the inability for the Mexican economy to distribute the wealth that's created. Many people would argue that it's much more a problem of distribution than of growth. And so, ironically, by liberalizing immigration, in some ways, it kind of, in the broader picture of Mexican politics, it enables the Mexican government to kind of kick the can down the road in terms of meaningful tax reform and other kinds of measures to keep the public sector robust, to keep the safety net robust to the extent that it never was, and to create more opportunities for rural and marginalized urban populations who are the folks that tend to be migrating to the U.S. So if there's any downside at all, I'm strongly in favor of the measure that the Obama administration is taking. But we're at a time, it's difficult for us to imagine, like Peter said, we're at a time when it's difficult for us to imagine also us, given the current political configuration, arguing for redistributive policies here in the U.S. And it certainly would be highly contradictory if we try to encourage that in Mexico and weren't really willing to take that on ourselves. So as a somewhat indirect response to your question, I think, if anyone else wants to respond.
I also have an indirect response. One of the many things that bothers me about the drug war is the way that this plays out in the U.S. media tend to kind of increase the racialization of the image of the Mexican in the United States. Okay? Those people are like that. Okay? They're violent, they're criminals. Okay? When you talk to perfectly rational people, which I've been trying to do for a long time now, about even I'm just going to what do I find? When you talk to people, your average Hoosier about immigration reform, they talk to you about worrying about the notion, and they phrase it in ways that they think are not racist, that Mexicans are more prone to crime than anyone else. And you can show them all the stats in the world about the fact that undocumented workers in the U.S. are the least likely group to commit a crime other than being undocumented. There's lots of stats on that. Okay, much less likely than the people in this room. Okay, and they still have this image that Mexicans are potentially criminal, potentially violent. Some of these images actually come from a long time ago, from the 19th century. But I suspect that the way events like the one that we're talking about play out in the U.S. media after they get filtered through Fox News or even through CNN and out into the American consciousness such that it is about what Mexico is, it further it deepens these racial images, and that makes me think that it runs against the possibility of further immigration reform.
Yeah, let me add that. If Mexico is currently facing a crisis of conscience, which it clearly is, I think we're about to enter into a phase like that here in the aftermath of Obama's speech and the directives he has issued. Of course, can't predict the future, but based on what we're hearing from the far right, we're in for a pretty ugly phase here, and I think we might be entering a crisis of conscience in our country in this regard as well.
I was hoping one of you could comment a little bit about what you see as the potential or maybe the patterns of the caravanas that are organized by the parents of the disappeared or dead. In terms of first going to talk to the Zapatistas in Chiapas, I know that on Wednesday they were in Michoacán talking, where that state has two very, very important, very politically active escuelas normalistas that, as you pointed out earlier, Professor Levinson, they are not always, they're not very sympathetic to some of the public because of some of their tactics. But I was wondering whether you could comment, is it significant that they're going to these two places in particular? Do you see that as a particular pattern?
Well, actually, my own take on that is that
it's a good first step in order to kind of consolidate your base, so to speak, but strategically in the end, it's got to go much broader than that, because essentially they're going to visit the folks that they know, they're preaching to the choir, so to speak. They're going to visit with folks in Chiapas and in Michoacan who have already been resisting the state, who have already been sounding this call for quite a long time. The question from there is, how are they going to reach out to sort of the ordinary middle class, lower middle class folks in urban areas in Mexico and other rural populations, and do a kind of public relations, if that's not too cynical a term to use. I think that the caravana that Javier Cecilia led several years ago was more successful perhaps in really kind of trying to reach a broad cross-section of Mexican society. And there's a risk in sort of going first and foremost to places like Michoacan and Chiapas that are where one sort of knows one will be well received. And I think that the burden perhaps upon them now strategically is to really kind of take it out from there and to try to really capitalize on what is becoming much more of a kind of common majoritarian sentiment in Mexico. It's not just the poor themselves, right? It's not just the rural folks themselves. Mexicans across all walks of life have been touched by violence, have been touched by the kind of impunity pursuant to that violence. And so I think that would be the next important step.
I think that we should never underestimate the power of the concentration of moral power in the parents of the disappeared young people, of the disappeared students, and it puts me in mind of Las Madres de la Plaza in Argentina, and in many other situations that are comparable in some ways. So there's a tremendous, even Newtown, even Connecticut, although we haven't seen the gun laws change very much in this country, but there's a tremendous moral force there, and there's a kind of an integrity and legitimacy to the parents, to the relatives of the disappeared, that has to drive this project.
Let me just add one brief comment. Mexico is a very much a stratified society in which these young men, the families they came from, are come from very marginal, very poor backgrounds, most of them very poor rural backgrounds. This is playing out in a way, and I very much admire all the activity that's gone on in Mexico about this, and the effort people put into this, and of course the grief of the parents. But if these kids that Brother was talking about, who were killed in Cuernavaca a few years ago, they were middle-class kids, and it was relatively easy for that Javier Cecilia and his people to sort of, get demonstrations going that had large quantities of middle class, and people from Ciudad Satélite, suburbs of Mexico City, involved in it. I think it's going to be more difficult in this case, even though people are really upset and they are really afraid in a lot of ways. It's still, in a lot of ways, they come from a different social group, and they're somewhat easy to marginalize for many middle-class Mexicans.
I wanted to make a really quick comment, since we have the photographs of the disappeared here with us, because I've heard in recent weeks a couple of times, once in the media and once just by someone who was talking about it, that these photographs seem like mugshots, and the kids in many ways seem like they could be easily portrayed through photographs like these as members of the drug cartels rather than as young students. And I think it's really important for those of you who aren't familiar with the Mexican cultural context. This is just a little tidbit about the fact that when portraits are taken, smiles are not encouraged. It's a big difference from kind of mainstream American culture where we're encouraged to smile and say cheese. These are probably their official identification. In most cases, they're their official identification. And the reason they have such a serious look on their faces is because that is the cultural norm for taking this kind of photo. And it's just a little cultural tidbit I think it's important to kind of put out there.
As moderator, I need to say that I promised Tammy that I would save the last 5 minutes for her to include some closing remarks. We've actually got 1 minute left. I don't know if do we have time for one more question?
I need like 2 minutes now.
2 minutes. Okay. Is there one last quick comment or question? Yes, up front.
Yeah. So Peter, you talked some about ways that we sort of top down things that could happen in America, policy regarding addiction. Do any of you put any weight in sort of in drug consumers here, sort of having some kind of revolution of consumer consciousness and realizing the ways that their cocaine habit is funding violence in Mexico?
I admit to having had that thought. Geez, if these people only really knew where the money was actually going and what uses it was put to in Mexico, would they think twice? Okay. Consumer boycott of cocaine. And then I think it ain't gonna happen. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, we do have the grow local, consume local ethos.
Is there one last very quick comment? Yes, in the back.
I think it's important to mention that all that is happening in Mexico and all over the world, not only in the US, but all over the world, is that this is not only about the 43 students that disappeared, but it's much more about what's been going on in Mexico for the past 15 years. So this is the spark, but there's a lot of, so the fuel of violence and all the drug wars and stuff is because of inequality and poverty. People have no options, so it's so easy to enter in this kind of war. So I think it's important to mention that violence and drugs is really more of a consequence rather than the actual problem. The problem is rooted in somewhere else. So since we are all discussing this right now, I thought it would be important to go a little bit, take the drug war to the side and focus on the actual problem, which is inequality and poverty. If we can deal with that, I'm sure all of these problems will be reduced highly, if not will be zero. So.
Bien dicho.
Okay, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And this forum was possible thanks to collaboration of many, many students, faculty, staff on this campus, and just in the general community. We would particularly like to thank CLACS, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and our Department of Spanish and Portuguese for funding, organizational support, promotional support, just more than I can really say right now. And I think that we need to give our speakers another round of applause. I think most of all that I'd like to thank you. We want to thank you for coming the Friday before Thanksgiving break, which was a great point. I'm pleasantly surprised by the amount of people. Gael and I received an incredible amount of email messages and Facebook messages asking how we could be supported and what could be done, and we really thank you for that. We thank you for your empathy and your solidarity, and we ask that you continue to offer that empathy and solidarity. And I think that that is one of the key ways that we can move forward from this. We can continue being informed, we can share our information, we continue caring, and not let this fall to the side like the events in Monterey that were mentioned earlier. I think that's one of the primary things that we can do. So thank you, have a wonderful break. If anybody would like further information, there is a Facebook group. You can also contact us via email. We'd be happy to keep the conversation going. So thank you.